All right, so let's discuss the nervous system. So we know it's the part of an animal that coordinates its actions by transmitting signals to and from parts of the body. Let's talk about the main divisions of the nervous system. First of all, there's the central nervous system, and this consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Then we'll talk about the peripheral nervous system. These are the nerves which connect the body. They branch off the central nervous system and connect it to the body. We further break the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, into some other parts. There's the somatic part, the somatic nervous system. This controls the voluntary movements associated with skeletal muscles. There's the autonomic nervous system, and this controls things that are largely unconscious, things like bodily functions, heart rate, digestion, respiration rate, urination, arousal. We further break that autonomic nervous system down into the sympathetic, the parasympathetic, and the enteric nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system is really important in the body's fight or flight response. It tends to speed up a lot of responses like heart rate, breathing rate, and so on. But it's also constantly active at a basic level to help maintain homeostasis. Its sort of opposite is the parasympathetic. It's responsible for sort of the rest and digest response, or the feed and breed activities. It's about keeping you calm, slowing down heart rate, slowing down breathing rate. But it also helps to maintain homeostasis. So these two work together to keep you balanced. The enteric division deals with your gastrointestinal system, regulating digestion. So let's also talk about the structure of a neuron. A neuron is a nerve cell, and we'll talk about it from a picture here. So here's a neuron, a basic neuron. So first of all, this is the cell body, or the soma. This is where the nucleus and the DNA are located. Branching off of that are multiple dendrites. These dendrites typically connect up to a receptor or to another nerve. Think of them like an antenna, and they are receiving information. They're receivers. Branching off that cell body or soma usually is one axon. This axon carries outgoing information. And at the terminal, this axon terminal is usually going to connect with either the dendrites of another neuron, or it might connect to a muscle cell at a neuromuscular junction. It's also important to note that that axon is oftentimes insulated with a fatty-like substance called myelin. And while we're looking at this picture, it's also important to note that there are certain sections of this myelin, or this axon, where there are gaps, rather, in the myelin sheath. Those little gap areas are called the nodes of Ranvier, and we'll talk more about them in a minute. So here we're looking at a synapse. So this is the end of an axon, and this is the beginning of a dendrite. These two communicate via the release of chemicals called neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are released by the axon. They diffuse across this little gap called the synapse, and they bind to receptors on the dendrite. And that stimulates a response in that postsynaptic neuron. So it's chemical messengers called neurotransmitters that will move the impulse from this nerve, the presynaptic neuron, to this nerve, the postsynaptic neuron. So we mentioned neurotransmitters already. Chemical signals produced by a neuron that transmit signals across the synapse to the next neuron or to a muscle. Just some names of neurotransmitters you might want to recognize: acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, nitric oxide, epinephrine. This is adrenaline, by the way, and norepinephrine. So let's also talk about an action potential. An action potential occurs when a neuron sends an electrical signal down an axon away from its soma. You might hear it referred to as a spike or an impulse. This is about, sometimes we might also call it a depolarizing current. But the action potential occurs when ions start moving across the neuron cell membrane. So let's look at a picture and talk about the action potential from here. So first of all, when a neuron is resting, we're going to say that it's polarized. And the reason that it's polarized is that inside that neuron, there are a lot of substances like proteins and so on, and also chloride ions that have a negative charge. There are also some positive ions in here, but the number of negatives outweigh the positives. So it's more negative on the inside of the cell, On the outside of the cell, there are a whole lot of ions moving around it there, particularly lots of sodium ions and some potassium ions too. Out here, it's positive. When a neuron is resting, the sodium-potassium pump is constantly pumping sodium ions out of the interior of the cell, and it's pumping potassium ions into the cell. So in this state, when the neuron is more negative on the inside and the environment outside is more positive, when there are more sodium ions outside, more potassium ions inside, the neuron is said to be polarized. I want you to think of this neuron almost like a rubber band that's been pulled back. It's ready to fire. So the way an action potential is going to happen is, first of all, there's some kind of stimulus. And what this stimulus will cause to happen is it will cause sodium channels to open. All right, so as I said a second ago, this happens mostly because of the movement of sodium ions and potassium ions. So down here, we see the resting state. So in this case, the sodium channels and the potassium channels are essentially closed, the activation channels at least. And then we get a stimulus. Stimulus happens right in here. And that stimulus begins the process of depolarization. So it causes some of the sodium channels, the sodium activation channels, to open. And because there's a higher concentration of sodium outside the neuron than there is inside the neuron, the sodium channels start to flood into the cell through those channels. That causes the membrane potential to start to go up because positive ions are entering the cell. And that will continue to go up until somewhere around 50, plus 50, maybe up to plus 70 millivolts, depending on the neuron. At that point in time, the sodium activation gates close. And the potassium activation gates open. Well, since there's more potassium on the inside of the cell in terms of concentration than there is on the outside, potassium ions begin to rush out of that neuron. And here we start to get what's called repolarization. So we've got depolarization going on over here, repolarization going on over here, because positives are leaving the cell, the membrane potential drops. There is a short period where both the sodium channels are closed, the potassium channels are open, and that causes what's called a little bit of an undershoot. So the membrane potential actually drops below the resting potential. During this time, the neuron can't fire. The sodium-potassium channel works to get the balance of sodium ions and potassium ions right on each side of the neuron. And at this point in time, once the membrane potential returns back to normal, the neuron's ready to fire again. So essentially, an action potential is an electrical impulse caused by the movement of sodium ions and potassium ions into or out of the neuron. So in terms of how this thing is propagated, this action potential is propagated down the neuron. It's propagated through a process called saltatory conduction. And essentially the action potential, instead of going through the whole axon, it jumps from node to node. When the voltage in one node reaches a certain level, it causes the voltage-gated sodium ion channels in the adjacent node to open up. And this initiates the action potential on that node. Well, when that membrane potential or voltage reaches a certain level, it causes the sodium ions in the next node to open. What this does is it causes the process to happen much faster. It causes propagation to happen much faster than it would if the nodes weren't there. So myelin's job is to increase the speed of an impulse's transmission. And it's very effective at doing that. And the process of the impulse jumping from node to node is called saltatory conduction. Let's look a little more closely at the synapse. So the synapse, again, is the connection between the axon terminal on one neuron, the presynaptic neuron, and the dendrite on the next neuron. It's kind of a gap-like connection. So once an action potential reaches the end or near the end of that presynaptic neuron, the voltage causes an influx of calcium ions, which in turn help to force out neurotransmitters through exocytosis into the synapse. I mentioned earlier some names of some important neurotransmitters in the body. Serotonin, GABA, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine are all good examples. But once these neurotransmitters are released, they diffuse across the synapse. They bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. Usually these are ion channel receptors. And once those neurotransmitters bind to them, they cause the ion channels to open, causing an influx of usually sodium ions into this postsynaptic neuron, and that starts the action potential in that neuron. So that's the way the action potential is transmitted from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. All right. The last thing we'll mention here about the nervous system is a reflex arc. So a reflex arc is a type of neural pathway. It's a neural pathway in which a receptor and then a sensory neuron carry information to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, there are neurons called interneurons that connect the sensory neuron to specific motor neurons, which then leave the spinal cord, go out to specific muscles, causing an innate kind of response. So the reason this reflex arc is set up, it's set up for speed. It's set up to cause essentially reflexes to happen that don't involve the brain, because the brain has to process things. So this reflex arc allows usually protective things like jerking your hand back from something hot to protect you without the brain having to think about that and cause you to do it. So here's again a diagram of a reflex arc. You've got receptors communicating via sensory neurons to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, interneurons connect to specific motor neurons, which go out to muscles, stimulating them to cause some reflexive response. This is all about speed, causing you to do something very fast and therefore protect your body. All right, that's it for the nervous system.